Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Asia House. My name's Anna Temby, and I'm the Literature Programme Manager here. This event is part of the Asia House Bagri Foundation Literature Festival, which is running until the 6th of November. Please do check out our events on asiahousearts.org, or you can pick up a programme in reception. If you're tweeting tonight, just to let you know, we've got different Twitter handles at Asia House. If you could please use at Asia House Arts instead of Asia House UK, that would be really great. And our hashtag is Asia Lit Fest. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers for this evening. Ben Dix is the founder and director of the company PositiveNegatives and a senior fellow at SOAS. And Asia Alfasi is a comic writer and artist who works really closely with Ben to translate important social and human rights issues into comic strip form. There'll be a chance at the end to ask your questions, and I think Ben and Asia will be sticking around at the end of this talk if you want to talk to them some more. So please do join me in giving a really warm welcome to Ben Dix and Asia Alfasi. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming, and I just want to open and introduce my colleague Asia. And just say thank you very much to Asia House for inviting us, and to the Bagri Foundation, which is a real honour. I first worked with the Bagri Foundation in 2001, where they funded my photo exhibition on the Maha Kumbh Mela, a Indian pilgrimage in 2001 at the Brunei Gallery. So it's really nice, kind of 17 years later, to be back working with the Bagri Foundation. Tonight we're going to present to you two very personal stories of how Asia and I got into the world of comics. Two very different but kind of similar stories. And we'll try and take you on a bit of a kind of personal narrative of how we found the illustrated form to tell complex and often traumatic stories. After presenting in the US a number of times, I find it's best to give some trigger warnings that our work is traumatic and it will cover issues of violence, sexual violence, migration, so just giving you a heads up. This is the first time that Asia and I have done a double act, so you can be the judge of how well that goes, but I'm really honored to be on stage with one of my favorite human beings in the world. So please welcome Asia Alfasi.
An absolute pleasure to be here, Asia House. Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and let's just go start on this journey, or at least my journey, into comics. Sometimes when I say to people, especially coming from an Arab background and to Arab parents, and then you try to convince them that I want to do something to do with comics, and for them to take it seriously, probably 9 times out of 10 the answer is definitely going to be not. There is nothing of worth that you can do wasting your time doing something to do with comics. And perhaps it comes from a very solid background that if you take into context, you would understand both of our perspectives. My perspective, in that they can have a huge, powerful impact on people's societies and cultures and communication between them, and on, well, to understand my parents' kind of like point of view, that something like that is almost like childish as well. I was born in Libya, in Tripoli, in 1984. And during that time, Libya was still freshly dealing with its dictatorship under Gaddafi. During the 80s, we call those years Sanawat al-Taqashuf, basically the years of the frugal years, because Libya during that time was completely closed off to the rest of the world. So trade was banned, it was considered against the law. So any enterprises, rent was against the law. Having private property other than something that you are actually using was against the law. To import anything from outside, clothes or food or something, was against the law. So Libya was very much closed. We did not have outside influence or like TV or comics or any of those things. However, the one thing that we did have, which was very much across the whole Arab world during the 80s and the 90s especially, is during the Arab world at that time, they imported a lot of Japanese animation dubbed over in Arabic, specifically in the Iraqi and the Syrian dialects. But the thing is, and they showed them once a week, those once a week showings of these anime, of these cartoons, were not missable by anyone. Old, young, grandparents, youth. Probably part of it is because there was nothing else really to do. But apart from that, it completely captured our imaginations. Perhaps some people would say, why? What was so amazing about these stories? Because at the time, in Japan, they were working on something called it's like the World Theatre Series, where they took some of the most well-known international literary hits of the world, and they turned them into animated series. So that was the first time that we got to know stories such as Tom Sawyer, Anne of Green Gables. We had Little Women, The Sound of Music. All of those stories, they would take a story, they would take a novel, and they would turn it into a series of 30 episodes that we watched and we enjoyed. So through that, we got our exposure, our first exposure, and we traveled with our imaginations across the world, from Europe to America to the prairies of, Canadian prairies to the Alps in France. All over, we traveled from this tiny little place where we actually never saw anything else except through that. And of course, one of the things that the Japanese covered is Sindbad, and probably because of Sindbad and watching it as a child, I used to think that anime or this kind of manga style of drawing was an Arab art form. Hey, I was 7 years old, I did not know any better. So, all of that came to a head when, with my family, at age 7, we traveled to Glasgow. As you might have guessed, I know it's hardly noticeable anymore after having spent 18 years in Birmingham, but you might have noticed a wee twinge of Scottish still left in my accent. And we went to Scotland. Scotland was an absolute different, it was a new phenomena for kids who had never left their tiny small villages or their neighborhood in Tripoli. It was just a completely new experience. Double-decker buses, the cathedrals, greenery, stuff like this that we're just not used to. And one of the first things that at the beginning I thought, this is going to resolve itself, was this issue of communication. That we went to, I don't know, one day I'm going to forgive my parents for this, but I don't know why they chose the East End of Glasgow to settle in. But at the time, and in the early 90s, that was not the friendliest place if you looked to be a bit different. And so I could not. My siblings and I, especially me at the time, because I was the first in my primary school to wear the hijab, and I was the first in my secondary school to wear it. And that exposed me to a lot of, I guess, being ostracized would be the nice way of putting it. And it just seemed that there was this insurmountable number of obstacles around me that separated me from my peers. Biggest thing about that is that I had absolutely nothing that I could hold up from my own culture and say, hey, this is from my culture that I'm going to, this is something really cool that you're going to love from my culture. I had nothing. I was telling actually Ben earlier that back then, especially the early 90s, there was very many different types of migration waves of refugees that came into the UK, and especially Glasgow at the time. So we were exposed to, I think, some remnants of the refugee children who, as a result of the Chechen and I think in the Bosnian war at the time, as well as a lot of Iranians. And what they did was, when you first come in, you don't know English, they put you in a language teaching center where you try and learn the language. To be fair, they did their best to teach us English, but the only problem about that is that they would teach us one thing, but as soon as we left and we go out and they were not speaking English outside. So for a long time, I actually thought that they were joking with us, that they were teaching us a language that were not being spoken in Glasgow at the time. It was certainly something else that we had to learn. But to put it into perspective, like the only thing that once I thought, this is something that we can finally be proud of. At the time, it was Back to the Future had come out, and at the very beginning scenes, I don't know if you remember, but in Back to the Future 1, there was like a group of Libyan terrorists that come in and they shoot Doc. And when they first come in, the Doc goes, "The Libyans!" And like we were watching, me and my siblings were like, "Yeah!" Like we featured. This was like the first time ever, because whenever at the time, like there was a huge issue with Gaddafi and the whole Lockerbie thing, and that happened in Scotland, so it wasn't really good to say you were Libyan. But from that day on, whenever somebody said, "Where are you from?" and like, "From Libya," "Where's that?" That was my moment, like to shine and say, "Do you know Back to the Future?" And they were like, "Yeah." "Do you know at the beginning, the terrorists?" And I was unironically doing that because this was something that was in a blockbuster movie, and they said the word Libyans. And we were so proud that they just said the word Libyans. That is just how starved I was to have something, to like, hey, we exist in the world. That changed when one day I went to the library. We always used to go to the library, free thing to do, fantastic. And I saw something that completely changed the trajectory of my world from that day on. And that was, I found a book there, a manga book. There was a small, tiny shelf with about like 6 different volumes of manga, and it was from a series that we watched when I was in Libya, and I was like 6 or 7 in Libya, but we watched it as an animation. I had no idea those things were available as books in a book format. And I was so excited and I was so emotional because it seemed like finally I had something back from my culture. Remember, guys, I thought at the beginning that manga was Arab, right? So I thought, finally, I found something that is from my culture, this old friend, again, that has come to say hi, and I'd been feeling so lonely and I could not connect to anyone. And finally, I have something that I can show to people and say, hey, this is from my culture. At the beginning, it had like, on most books at the time, when they have manga, they have a sort of almost big thing that says, original Japanese manga. I quickly got over that shock. But from then on, I decided I'm going to start drawing this style. And as soon as I started drawing manga, something amazing happened. All of the kids and all of my peers who used to bully me before, like the day before, became fans. Instead of seeking me out in order to bully or annoy me or take the piss out of me, no, they would actually fight for the place to sit next to me quietly and watch as I drew. And that was extremely shocking for me at the time and extremely powerful. These were people, if you had told me, like, would they ever accept you? Is there anything in the world you can ever do where they'd be happy for you just being exactly the same as you are? I would have told you no. But yet, this Japanese art form managed to bridge this gap between a Libyan schoolgirl and her Scottish schoolmates. And I just thought, if it can have a power such as this is just the beginning. How far can you go with something like this? Can you do it further? That was the extent at the beginning of my story with manga, and afterwards I started to leave off into other types of drawing and storytelling. The first graphic novel that I read that changed all of that was Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Since all of you are here and you're interested in comics, I wager that a good number of you know at least of Art Spiegelman's Mouse, where he drew about his own family's experience during the Holocaust. But something that he did that was very different from anything else at the time was that he drew all of the Jews as mice, and he drew the German jailers and such as cats. And something here, you could say, what is the point of that? And at the very beginning, when I first picked up the book, I will not lie to you, I thought, this is a bit ridiculous. How am I going to be able to take this seriously? But as I read, I realized that doing something like this, giving people the chance to step back a little bit, sometimes even through the door of the obscene, even if it's, I think it's like the ridiculous, you give them the space to consider and to explore very serious topics, or sometimes really triggering topics, in a way that is not extremely personal, that it would not absolutely shut down the topic because it's just too real. I explored further and I realized that there's almost no limit to what you can discuss using the medium of comics or graphic novels or manga. Osamu Tezuka, who's considered the godfather of manga, created so many stories about different things. A lot of them were, I guess, like, the sci-fi, or he created stories just out of his, mind, imagination. But he also created this story, this 8-part graphic novel about the story of Buddha and his life and legacy. He was not a Buddhist himself. And at the beginning, again, sometimes I find myself thinking, well, I'm not Buddhist, what can I get out of this? But time and time again, it managed to open my eyes to stories and to depths of issues that I never would have otherwise. The very first time when it comes to, this was now circa after the 9/11 attacks and all of the fall through that was happening after that, Joe Sacco's Palestine. Also, so I was starting to now to concentrate and to see what have people done, or the people who have taken Arab issues or covered kind of Islamic characters, how did they do that? Is there any representation out there? How has it been done? And with Joe Sacco's Palestine, even though, again, I was so extremely excited to see images and people and characters that hearken to me and my own heritage, that yes, finally we have, some kind of representation, even sometimes with the facial features that you see, that if you are never, for example, used to seeing, for example, black superheroes or something, that it actually makes it's extremely emotional, and you finally do have a representation, no matter sometimes how bad or how shallow or how small or how fleeting. All of it matters. But the problem with Joe Sacco is that he is, again, talking from the point of view of somebody who is outside of the situation. He is a passerby. He is watching the situation from the outside. No matter how much he can tell you or speak to you about an issue, it's going to be from the perspective of somebody who is at least 2 steps removed. I don't know how many of you have taken in terms of really serious topics, and when I talk about the absurd, marrying a really simplistic drawing style, almost childish, with a huge issue, in this case, the thought of a nuclear warfare, a very real possibility that once reigned supreme over, I'd say, the whole world, especially during the Cold War. And the exploration of that in Raymond Briggs' When the Wind Blows. Again, I loved where every single time I pick up a book and I think, this is not, I have an idea in my mind how it's going to go, but the person can, through their storytelling and through juxtaposing extremely different either styles and the topic in question, they can bring you something that is just so new, and it forces a perspective upon you that you might not have considered before, just by the sheer absurdity of it. Another huge book here, I'm really sorry for the difficulty of this image, but I got into a few discussions with some people. Of course, this is the heyday of the internet. Everybody is having arguments. Internet arguments were the thing, back in the early 2000s. And one of the things was talking about the atomic bomb in Japan. And you find lots of people who speak about it in a very detached way. This is what needed to be done. There was no other way. This was the only way to end the war, therefore it was good. And I found this book, this graphic novel series by a man who was a child, and he lived in Hiroshima when the first bomb was dropped. And he lived through that experience, and he drew exactly what happened, stage by stage, of the horrific nightmare that unfolded afterwards. And when you read something like that from No, this is not from the point of view of like a soundbite from a news source or a news station or something with an agenda. No, this is just a human story. And it gave a completely new and raw humanitarian angle that strips you back to your own humanity, and you are forced again to reconsider again and again, where do I stand on these issues as a human being? The first time that I saw a hijab character on the front cover was Marjani Satrapi's Persepolis, and that was a huge moment for me. I was like, yes, finally, we've made it. But Marjani Satrapi's Persepolis, of course, I knew nothing about the Iranian Islamic Revolution at the time. I just made a judgment on the cover, and I jumped in. And there was something afterwards, even though I absolutely loved the story, and I loved the characters, and this lady knows how to create a story, and her book was the one that inspired me to actually go for creating graphic novels myself. However, this is a very important story that brings me into it. Something that I had noticed there that really left a sour taste in my mouth at the time. And at the time, France was going through discussions in banning the hijab in public spaces, in schools, and in all public properties. So I was having lots of discussions and arguments with people. And basically, the thing that really irked me was that every single time there was a hijabi character, she was evil. Almost like without recourse, that she is just going to be evil. And for a time, I held this grudge until one day Paul Gravett, I thank him very much, and I owe that man so many great things that happened in my life. He managed to organize for me to meet her, and I got to ask her directly, Marjani, why is it that every single time you drew a hijabi character, she was evil? I didn't like that. Why are you almost exacerbating the situation? And she said, Asia, I drew my own experiences, my own life experiences, and this is how I remember my experiences. Nobody can tell a story other than from the perspective through which they lived. If you have a different point of view, if you have a different perspective, then draw it, write it, because nobody can speak your voice for you. Only you know your own voice, only you know your own truth, only you know your real perspective. You cannot demand of someone else to do that, and you cannot possibly expect for anyone else to know. And to be fair, I was just like, yeah, you're right. What else do you say to that? It's true. I mean, somebody can sit down and expect or demand for other people to draw their experiences, but they will never get it right because they have never lived it. And so I decided to do just that. I looked into all sorts, far and wide, into what makes me me. What kind of things did I grow up on? What kind of things were that child, when I was a kid in Glasgow, in school, what can I create for that kid to go, here's this really cool thing from my culture that I'm going to share with you that I didn't have. How can I give them something cool to show to their friends that is like from Arab culture and not like stolen from the Japanese? So I started looking at different things. Some of them were like Juha. Juha is a huge folkloric character in the Arab world. Afterwards, I realized that actually the Turkish say that he is Turkish. The Iranians say, no, do not believe the Turkish, he's definitely Iranian. Then I went to Russia, and they were like, do not believe either of them, that he's Russian. I was like, he is the perfect international character. So I looked into things either in like the theology and the philosophy of Islam to create a completely new fantasy world. I'm still kind of like working intermittently on that, but I'm extremely, I can't wait actually to unveil this story at some point. In other words, like our stories that our grandmothers passed to us, there's a huge oral tradition across the Arab world, and I'd say across Africa as a whole. Perhaps I don't know much about, the Asian folkloric tradition, but perhaps they too have. I think probably maybe if you go back enough, you'd find that very much true in a lot of cultures. So I said, why not draw some of these stories? Some of these stories, I've heard the rehashing of the same fairy tales again and again and again in the West. So how many times have you seen iterations of Alice in Wonderland, for example, or Cinderella, or any of those stories? There were some stories that I heard after tracking so many grannies and sort of like forcing them to tell me stories that were amazing, and they have never seen the light of day. And so, again, this is something that I'm really excited to do justice by. Last but not least, and sometimes I really regret almost starting with something, with a story so personal, but I decided that after the last, few years, especially post 9/11, and then all of the things that happened here in the UK and beyond in Europe, that there was so much that is unknown about Arabs and culture. I heard so many times like, oh, just nuke the whole region and get rid of it. Oh, it's just so full of problems, nothing comes out of it except a lot of complications. But to me, it's like I just realized that a lot of the time, they bring the same faces every time. Every single time an issue happens, you have the exact same, 3-4 minutes in which to try and communicate a whole issue or to represent a whole people. And people are seldom ever that shallow or easy or straightforward. And so what I decided to do was tell the story of my own family in Libya for people who didn't know anything about the Arab world, who've never been there, especially Libya was a very closed country. What kind of experiences make people people? And the first, at first it devolved into 2 books. The first book takes place in Libya, and the second book takes place in Glasgow. So that people, they would see Libya first from point of view of a family, and then they would see the UK through the points of view of an immigrant family. And this is probably, I'd say, a point of view that we don't usually see in the UK. It was a bit of a problem when I say I wish sometimes that I did not start off with this, because it was a hugely personal story and one that had to keep evolving for many different reasons. At the beginning, when I started drawing this, I was not able to speak about I could not put anything in context because Gaddafi was still in power. 2 of my uncles had gone, they were put in prison and then massacred in prison. And to be absolutely honest, the first few times that I drew chapters about it, my mom pretty much straight up ripped the chapters in front of me because she said, I had given her the originals to read, and she ripped them in front of me, and she said, are you that selfish? Are you that idiotic that you cannot see just how much this would hurt so many people? Our family is all there. We would end up with nothing, and you would endanger the whole family for no reason just because you wanted to publish a story. So I took steps back. I tried to say things but not say things. So I was not able to say, for example, my family had trouble finding a place or buying a place. Why couldn't you rent? If you couldn't say, oh, because rent was against the law. Right, okay, so there was a time where I was like, people during events, when they went to buy clothes, they would buy a random bag full of random pieces of clothing, items of clothing. They didn't know what was inside it. And then my editor was just right, why? My transcripts kept just coming back with why in the margins, why? I couldn't say why. I could not put anything in perspective. I just said, in the 70s when my parents went to university, there was a lot of troubles in university at the time. I couldn't say that at the time, and as in every single almost country in the world, it's usually the students that lead any revolt. It's usually the students that spearhead any movement for change. And that was not an exception in Libya as well. So when that happened, it became a festival, a yearly festival in Libya on the 7th of April to hang students who disagreed in public. But I couldn't say that, so I just said there were troubles in the 70s in universities. And I hated what I'd written and drawn so much because it just felt so shallow that I completely gave up on the book. I could not hand that in because it gave nothing. It gave no information. It gave no insight. Until 2011. In 2011, in January, I went to Libya and I was just like, that's it. I'm going to draw the book once and for all, nice peace and quiet. That February, the revolution started and the Civil War began. My family blamed me for starting it because I hadn't come to Libya for quite a while. And like, this is not, yeah. So I began redrawing the whole plot of the book, and this time putting in each and every single thing that I wanted. I put in the context for everything, and I found that every single time I wanted to put a bit of context in, I had to step backwards. So when I wrote that, when it came to like, okay, why weren't those things allowed? Because Gaddafi said they were against the law. Why were people obeying Gaddafi? Because Gaddafi was part of a military coup. Why were people happy when he first came into power? That's because people had just come out of being colonized for several years, and there was a huge anti-colonization, decolonization drive that was happening across Africa at the time. And Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt was freeing, speaking about finally having some kind of Arab pride. This really, a lot of Arabs across the region loved it. This was the very first time any pride was being spoken about. This is the very first time they were able to speak about or carry or be allowed to say that they had some kind of personality, some kind of control over their own lives and their own countries. It was a heady, almost drunken experience to be able to hear words like this, let alone support them or support somebody who says them. And then why did Jamal Abdel Nasser happen? That's because it was an era of civil rights across the world in America. So what was happening in America with Muhammad Ali, with Malcolm X, was very much having concrete results and ripples across the whole of Africa. When you put everything into context, things start to make sense. So I had to keep stepping back and putting things into more and more context, putting the family context into Libya's political context, putting Libya's political context into Arabian societal kind of cultural context, putting the Arabian cultural context within that of the worldwide at the time. And only then I had to start mapping it with things that happened at the time. So things like the moon landing. This was something that was watched across the world. My parents' marriage, which happened, Mom watched Princess Diana get married like a month before she did. Things like this that just instantly just go, aha, people wearing, the Beatles were huge in Libya. Even Mom at the beginning was telling me the Beatles and the Hebes were very, very well known. I was like, what the hell are the Beatles and the Hebes? And then afterwards I realized, oh, the Beatles and the hippies, So it was just, to hear something like that and put it into context and find understanding. And through that, I realized that even for me, and I thought I used to know Libya, it was quite amazing because it put things that are happening today into context. When you try to understand a lot of the confusion and a lot of the turmoil that is happening today, it's not enough to jump back 10 years, it's not enough to jump back 20 or 30. You really need to go back in order to have a nuanced understanding of how everything fits together, and then only then, I believe, we can have a hope in hell for trying and starting to resolve some of those issues. At the beginning, by the way, of course, in 2011, another huge thing that I realized was the power of social media and drawings, where you would draw something in response to something that was happening, and then you would find that it has 10,000, 50,000 shares. This is something that it really humbled me at the beginning. And this was like one of the first images of mine to go viral across Libya, and for people to just really engage with an image that you can tell so much, or you can call for a certain unity through an image that people, it resounds with them and they share it far and wide. So in terms of what can comics change, they can change so much. And at the beginning, I used to think that maybe people can only draw their own personal experiences, because all of this for me has been pretty personal. Is there any way to try and bring in other people's experiences, other people's voices? Perhaps they can't draw. Perhaps they have really pertinent stories to tell, really powerful stories and narratives that we need to listen to, and points of view, things that humanize issues. But how are we supposed to do that? How am I supposed to reach such people? And this is afterwards where I reached and got in touch with Ben Dix. So I'll hand you over to Ben for now. It's for you to hear his journey of how he got into comics, and then we'll meet back afterwards for how we got our partnership together to work on that extra step beyond the personal or beyond the me. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hide behind here for a bit. Thank you, Asia. So that was a very personal story of how Asia got into comics, and mine was different. I was born in the UK, in Kent, and at 19 I went off to India. I spent 4 years in India before coming back and joining SOAS as an undergrad, and after SOAS I went back to India as a photojournalist. And I mentioned before the Bagri Foundation funded this exhibition that I had done. So I got a job as a photojournalist for a newspaper based in Delhi. And on the 26th of December 2004, the South Asian tsunami hit. I was in Bombay at the time, and an old friend of mine from SOAS was working in the Vani, which is the area circled there in the north of Sri Lanka. A little background to Sri Lanka, for those of you who don't know, although I'm sure many of you do. Sri Lanka had been through almost a 30-year protracted conflict between the Tamil Tigers, who were based in that area, the Vani, who were a rebel group, an independent struggle for Tamil Elam of the north and east of Sri Lanka. They were Tamils, and the government, Sinhalese government, Buddhist, in pretty much the rest of the country. Very, and I'm aware Yolanda's in the back there, who's an expert on Sri Lanka, so I'm not going to go much more deep into that. But that is an introduction into the conflict in Sri Lanka. So there was an independent struggle of the north and east against the army. When I got there, James had invited me up. He was supposed to come and visit me in Bombay that morning when the tsunami hit, and this was the devastation. 36,000 people died on the island that morning. And I got on a plane, went there, and arrived the following day to this scene. It's something I'd never seen before. I'd never worked in a natural disaster, in a catastrophe of this magnitude. Was something just completely overwhelming. The internationals were, pretty much it was James and I, because pretty much everyone else was back for their Christmas holidays. It was a peace process was happening at the time, so there wasn't really a huge amount of development work. It was quite small-scale work that was happening there. And James and I rolled up our sleeves and got involved, of picking out bodies from trees and bushes and putting bodies in the mass graves, and really just getting involved and meeting the Tamil Tigers, the civilians, through this devastating natural event that had happened. Through that time, those first 10 days, which I thought how long I was going to be in Sri Lanka, I was immediately struck by the hospitality, the kindness, the generosity of the community. It's an incredibly rural area, controlled by the Tigers. There wasn't much development up there. Politically, it was fascinating that it was this group that was fighting against the state, and it fascinated me. I fell in love with the place in terms of its environment and its people. And the Norwegians, Norwegian People's Aid, gave me a job as their communications officer. So I ran around photographing the aftermath of the tsunami and the development, the aid, the humanitarian responses. Within the environment, because of the protracted war between the Tigers and the government, there were landmines all over the place. Now, these have been very well mapped by the Tigers and by the government, but due to the tsunami churned up all of the ground along that coast and suddenly scattered these mines everywhere. So where we were working, trying to build temporary houses for the survivors of the wave, we were also finding mines all over the place. So it made it an incredibly complex environment to work in, to constantly get kind of materials up through across the government into tiger lines, and then have to work with this community amongst active landmines. The environment, I found, it was clean, it was fresh, it was a place where I could breathe and engage with the communities, the politics, the culture of the place. And I was 28 years old, and I think I was quite enamored and excited by the environment, by the kind of struggle of the place. And I got really into my photography again, and I started photographing the nature, not just the humanitarian response, but also just the beauty of the place and the people. In 2007 or 2006, new president Rajapaksa came in and started a real push on this kind of nationalistic drive to rid the island of terrorism. It was kind of riding that wave of the war on terror, that they had domestic terrorists in the country, and there had been a number of wars throughout the 80s and 90s trying to destroy the Tigers, and it hadn't worked. The Tigers kept fighting back, and this time it was a big push. The kind of post 9/11, the independent struggles of this world turned into terrorist organizations, and the Tigers fell into that category very clearly. And so suddenly Rajapaksa was able to drum up international support to really do a last kind of massive offensive onto the Tiger region, which is where we were. I was based here in this town of Kilinochchi, in the blue spot here, right in the middle of it all. And what I was finding interesting, but also very, very difficult as we got closer into the war, was the very, very fine line that this photograph really sums up between the Tamil and the Tiger. Almost every family that I met around that area had an active Tiger member in their family, a brother, a sister, an uncle. And therefore, as the war started to increase, that line became more blurred, and the Tamil civilians became kind of legitimate targets in the eyes of the government. The Tigers were very active as they went through the Vani, and we're constantly seeing scenes like this of Tigers coming back from the battle zones after fighting. And my job at that point was with the United Nations for the last 2 years. I was there, 2007 and 2008, and I was the communications and liaison officer between the Tigers and the UN. And so my job every day was to go to the Tigers, who were conscripting some of our staff, who were conscripting teenagers around the place, and working out, 1, can we have our staff back? 2, can you stop conscripting teenagers? And 3, where are these people moving? And where can we kind of build our IDP, internally displacement camps? I was seeing scenes like this, where I was getting to this boy's house that had been shelled the night before. His mother and his sister had been killed in that shell, and this kid was incredibly shell-shocked, was just paralyzed with fear. His dad was packing up the belongings, and then they would migrate further and further into the Vani, away from the battle zones. And so I was seeing scenes like this, where a family or the remains of a family would have time to pack up their belongings. They might have some diesel for their tractor, they had some money to be able to put on their material possessions and make that first displacement away from their home further into the interiors of the Vani. When they got into the jungle, they would then erect a house, some kind of hut like this, and they would stay there for 2 or 3 weeks until the army was pushing further and further north. And then they would have to make a second, a third, a fourth, multiple displacements. And suddenly the scenes were going like this, where it was a tractor full of people but no material assets. And so you could see the vulnerability of people, of the community, spiraling. They were getting further away from their paddy fields, from their fishing, and less material assets, vulnerability. And then that started to bring in things like mental health issues, alcoholism, domestic abuse, sexual violence, all of these trigger issues that were a product of that vulnerability. And after the many displacements, you suddenly got into scenes like this, where people were living under just tarpaulin in the middle of forests. And obviously, the vulnerability of this scene is incredibly high. There's no medical supplies, water, food, sanitation, all of these issues. And so we were running around the United Nations trying to work that out. My job, and that was me 14 years ago, was to sit every day with the Tigers and to work out where these battle zones were happening and move people away. I always had to meet them out in the jungle in a place like this because their military bases were legitimate targets, and so I wasn't able to go there. This is actually to meet the guy that I was meeting, one of the political leaders. Is taking the picture because he didn't want to be in the photograph, and I always found it quite sweet that he would come with so many bodyguards as though I was some kind of threat to him, but it made me feel quite special anyway. But this would then spiral towards the end in late 2008 into complete chaos like this, where there was 400,000 people on the move. At that point, us at the UN and the NGOs had shrunk into such a small space that where we could actually operate because of the danger in those areas. So we were building bunkers in our compounds. This is the building of our bunker that then became my home for many months before we evacuated. And my dog Roxy, who saved our life many times. He would hear the fighter jets come over about 10 seconds before we heard them, and he would run around the compound, barking, 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 and we would all shoot down into the bunker. And yeah, he was a good lad. This became our bedroom down in the bunker, and it was down there that I read Mouse, which is the same graphic novel that Asia read. And one of my colleagues had it lying around. There's not much to do in a bunker. You start spending 8 to 10 hours a day down there. I watched all of the Peep Show. I started watching Wire, and I read Mouse. And I was inspired, just as Asia was, of how you could tell such a complex, traumatic story of the Holocaust through sequential art. And I came out of the bunker that morning and got my coffee and looked around and thought, I'm going to do a graphic novel on this. No one's reading my UN reports. And I knew that no one was reading my UN reports because I used to put Elvis Presley sightings in my UN reports. And no one flagged my Elvis Presley sightings, which means no one read them. And I was a little bit busy then to start doing a graphic novel in the middle of an active conflict zone, but I kind of parked that idea that this is what I was going to do at some point. The air attacks were brutal, and it started, this particular attack, this is our next door neighbour's compound that got completely pulverised. The house was there, and that's the rubble. As 6 o'clock in the morning, 2 fighter jets flew over and bombed the entire road that they had been tipped off that there was Tamil Tiger bases that had taken over civilian homes in this area. I don't know if that's true, but what did happen was that triggered our evacuation, and the UN in Colombo and in New York ordered for our evacuation about a week later. When we came out of those bunkers, the scenes that I was seeing in the civilian bunkers was horrific, and you start to realize the very, very different lived experience that the white international aid worker is having compared to the civilian. We were in fortified bunkers and the civilians were in dugout sandy pits, and an air attack even in a fortified bunker is scary, but in one of those sandy pits is just incredibly traumatic. And I went out to the field and to the IDP camps for one of the last times and took this photograph, which to me really symbolized the vulnerability that we were leaving 400,000 civilians in. We left after multiple displacements. They had the clothes on their backs, and we left. And that's something that has changed the course of my life, that decision of leaving. I was in the final car. I took this picture in the evacuation at 10:45 on the 18th of September 2008 through fresh air attacks with burning trees and tractors on the side of the road. And I drove out of there full of shame, abandonment, failure on a personal, emotional, professional level that destroyed me. I quit my job the next day. I flew back to London. I went to see Yolanda at Amnesty International and showed these photographs, told these stories, and we went on a little tour around Geneva to the embassies in Geneva to tell these stories and show these photographs. The Sri Lankan government got very upset with me that I was kind of telling these stories. The UN got upset with me that I was telling these stories. And then Channel 4 approached me and we did a documentary on the conflict called No Fire Zone. And through that time, I was getting many, many emails from friends, from colleagues of the deaths of my friends and colleagues. And I lost 36 friends in that conflict. And back in London, I was suffering from post-traumatic stress. I certainly couldn't do this. I couldn't stand up and present this to you. I hated being the friend in the group who was full of misery and trauma. That kind of went against my natural, slightly upbeat extrovert self. But I couldn't work out the enormity of what we had just left and what had happened in this place on the other side of the world. So I thought, I'm going to readdress this idea of doing a graphic novel. I linked up with Lindsay Pollock, who is another one of my favorite people, and we've been on a 6-year journey together. We thought it would take about 4 months to do this book. I think I talked to you, Yolanda, about it, and back in 2012, and thought, okay, I'm going to do this book. And we just signed a publishing deal last week, which is pretty sweet. So this time next year, we'll have the book out. There's 250 odd pages. And as we started mapping out the book and putting the story arc and all the maps and the pins and getting all of my photography and stuff, I was receiving emails from my surviving colleagues and friends who were popping up in London, Zurich, Chennai as refugees, as asylum seekers. So I ran around with Lindsay and started to interview them. And we thought, actually, this is the story. The story is, it's not my story, it's their story of what they've gone through from the tsunami to that displacement, and then what happened after we left and how they came to be in the UK. So we started to interview them, and then another old friend at Sussex University said, this would be a really interesting PhD. How you take these very, very complex testimonies and turn them into art. So that's certainly never been on my radar, but as Lindsay was drawing the PhD, I could submit excerpts of the graphic novel as my thesis. So I thought, well, if ever I'm going to do a doctorate, I can outsource about a third of it. So now's probably the time. So I tackled it as a PhD, and it was fantastic to go through that, because suddenly you couldn't just write a narrative. You had to defend every action, every character, every moment. You had to back up with references, with facts, with reports, with all of this material, so that this graphic novel that comes out next year isn't a work of fiction. This is a piece of research, and it's just presented in an illustrated form. Throughout that time, I realized that actually the responsibility that I had to tell these stories was very deep, and it wasn't something that you could just tell the narrative as I saw fit. I'm not the owner of these stories, so I had to keep going back to the respondent with the scripts and saying, is this your story? And therefore we developed this really interesting participatory methodology where I would go and interview someone at length, a week's worth of interviews, then come back with all of that material and all the research, the reports, the photography, etc., and develop a script. Then take the script back to the respondent and say, does this represent your story? It's anonymized, it's slightly fictionalized to tell a narrative arc, and we'd sit down again, you can see, go through lots of coffee and cigarettes and go through this, and give them the space to edit so that it represented their lived experience. Lindsay would then storyboard it on the left. And we would take the storyboards back to the respondent to say, does this look like your story? And again, they would say, no, there were more trees, there were bodies floating in the lake, there were whatever it was. And again, they would go through that whole editorial process so that when we finally inked it here, this is something that I can stand on this podium and say, this isn't a piece of fiction. This is a piece of work that has been tested and checked by the people who own their stories. And so this is one of my respondents in Zurich, going through it page by page, panel by panel, giving us feedback on how this looks. And it was just over the road here in Paddington Station going down one day. I checked my email and Lindsay had sent me this drawing from there. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, this is something we're going to do. This is beautiful. It gives dignity to this horrific experience. And actually, this is bigger than the Sri Lanka story. And it was then when I thought, I'm going to build PositiveNegatives as an organization, as a non-profit that tells stories of people, of marginalized communities, individuals who don't have that global voice, who aren't invited to stand on this stage and give their story. We're going to use PositiveNegatives to tell their stories through art. So, to go back to the Sri Lanka piece, I was just going to give you some excerpts of the book, of how we took all of those photographs that you saw at the beginning of Anthony here, the protagonist, as a fisherman, and kind of introduces you to what Tamil culture in northern Sri Lanka looks like, of living in these kajan huts under the palmyra trees, and in many respects quite an idyllic life. Incredibly problematic, but environmentally quite stunning and beautiful. The tsunami coming in and how that was an experience for people. And this again is something, this 2004, so it's before we had smartphones. People weren't videoing the tsunami at that point, but from interviews, from understanding people's stories, we'd be able to draw it. And then the aftermath of it, of those homes that were destroyed, the churches, the mosques that were destroyed along the coastline, and people's experiences there. And then what I started to find with this illustrated form was that it could take you into people's emotions, the traumatic stress that I was also experiencing, the respondents who were experiencing this. So this is one of our respondents, Indran, who had experienced a multi-barrel rocket launcher going off, an explosion in the refugee camp he was in, and what he had seen with his own eyes of just this devastation of humanity in front of him. And this was an image that he carried around in his head as a refugee here in London. And so suddenly sitting with Lindsay and talking to him and listening to his stories, and Lindsay drawing, Indran got really involved in the image, and he was saying, no, you know, the body's like this and the shells were like this, and getting involved. And it was clearly very cathartic for him, and it was a whole process of like, wow, this is powerful. This can take you into places where in film you might need kind of slightly cheesy special effects. With the illustrated form, it's incredibly powerful to get this into a narrative. And then to take you on a journey with this family through pages and pages of illustrated form of their displacement, of the tiredness of children, of the excitement of some. I've interviewed some people that went on an adventure, and it's the same with Syrian refugees. I interviewed them across Europe. Some of them were on an amazing adventure, but were traumatized. And all of this stuff and the spiraling into this chaos towards the end before we evacuated. And then on the flip side of the explosion and Indran's story of what happened inside his head was the quiet, nuanced details of conflicts that we were able to show through the illustrated form. So these very quiet moments where there was a 20-minute lull in the fighting, and a family would sit round a fire, and a daughter would fall asleep on a mother's lap, or a father would put his arm round his son, and they would sit in front of the fireplace and just talk and share stories as a family. And suddenly you're working with this medium where it can take you into all of these details and really, really sensitive moments of people's experiences. And then the asylum process itself, the often, unknown moments of migration that the media doesn't really pick up on. Like, what's it like for Anthony, the protagonist here, to get on a plane in Chennai in southern India to say goodbye to his wife and child, and on a false passport get on a plane and come to England, costing him $20,000. And if he got caught anywhere along the journey, he'd probably be sent back to Sri Lanka, potentially killed, never see his wife and kids again. The stress that someone holds when they make that journey. I'm sure all of us have jumped on a train without a ticket, and it's an uncomfortable train ride when you think, is the conductor coming, you know? The enormity of this is huge. The first time he had ever eaten a nut with a knife and fork was on that plane. He eats with his right hand. The first he wanted to blend in, so he sat down on the plane, tried to open the window, because you do that on a bus or a train or anything, so you do it on a plane. And just those experiences that are so detailed and nuanced, but they're such a massive, powerful part of someone's narrative. And then when he arrives in London, you've seen him in his fishing boat on the shores of Sri Lanka, and suddenly being in the metropolis of London with all the noise, the language, the sounds, the smells, the chaos, the disorientation of it all. And then this is probably one of the saddest, I think, most emotional pages that Lindsay drew, was this loneliness of him coming back to a bedsit in London, you know, his asylum flat given by the state, with all the free pizza leaflets on the floor, coming in and cooking for himself. And a Tamil man wouldn't cook for himself. He would be cooked for by his wife or his mother, and he would eat as a family. And to suddenly sit there and eat beans on toast in this horrible little flat and fall asleep in front of the TV, and then live back through these experiences again and again and again. And so the comic was able to take us through this whole narrative all the way to the end, to where he is now in 2018. And it's been an incredible journey. And while we've been working on that project, PositiveNegatives kind of came to life, and we now have got a portfolio of over 40 projects and currently 28 in production, of issues from asylum seekers on Manus Island in Australia, crack cocaine addiction of West Africa, migration from Eritrea to Europe. We're doing work in refugee camps in Jordan, of Syrian refugee camps, to try and make comics for children to learn through comics as part of their education processes. And we're now working, mostly our portfolio is with academic research now, which is to work on long 4-5 year projects where we go in as a methodology, as part of the academic team, and we turn that academia, we turn these peer-reviewed articles and those monographs, those ethnographies, into graphic novels, into short comics and animations. And that's a really wonderful process of really honing that skill of that methodology and working with now local artists from all over the world. We try and get the right gender of artists, the right ethnic background, so that we can really people can tell their own stories through their communities. And I get to work with awesome illustrators like Asia and Lindsay, and I've kind of switched my team from the UN to this great team of artists. This is where we got to do the double act bit, isn't it? So now we talk. This is a project that Care International commissioned for us on a Yazidi family escaping from northern Iraq and coming to Europe. And Asia was commissioned to do this project, and it was our first collaboration, I think, wasn't it?
Yes. So the thing about working with a company or telling other people's stories other than your own, I guess at the moment I worked on probably different lengths of stories or issues with PositiveNegatives. This story was really interesting because it posed several challenges, I'd say, that I did not face when I was drawing my own stories. As you have just seen right now, there's an incredible amount of work that goes into making sure that when you are telling a story, especially if it carries through real issues or real people, or it tells things that have some sort of political or faith or religious footing, then you have to be really careful, and there's a lot of responsibility to take going into telling that story. So Nadia's story, The problem, I'd say, with having one of the biggest challenges that I had working with, I guess, a company, or if you work for an NGO, or I think this one was CARE, did you say,
CARE,
International, is they would tell you a long story, and then they would tell you, please draw that in 3 pages. So that has so many different challenges and different difficulties, because for me, I'm used to not just telling a narrative, but I would try to go into the emotional aspects, because it's emotion that tells the story rather than the actual happenings themselves. So I try to inject little bits of emotion to slow it down a little bit, so it's not just about then this happened, this happened, this happened, and to slow it down instead. So for example, here there was a part where the family is arguing, and the little girl was listening, of course, to all of this stuff, and she reacts to it and she cries. If I was to just do it with the original script that I'd had, there was no space for this, but it's when you see her listening and then you see her reaction and her reaction afterwards, then it makes a lot more sense. Another huge difficulty, if you can actually, go forward actually, and another one.
Another one?
Yeah, sorry, one more. Yeah, is that a lot of this horrific stuff and some of the stories, they're more horrific than anything that I've ever experienced. I know at the beginning Ben said we came at comics from a similar background, and I was like, nope, not at all, alhamdulillah. By that time, I hadn't seen the horrific atrocities that he had. I got a little bit of a chance to live through 2011 in Libya, as I stayed the whole year there during the beginning of our civil war. But something they would tell you is that they would give you something really horrific, like this family seeing ISIS burn people alive, but then you have to tell that part of the story but not show it at the same time. So you'd have to come up and improvise new ways to do that, to tell that story, to communicate these issues without showing gratuitous violence, but at the same still communicating the horror of what they've seen. So in this example, for example, I just drew the fire in the pupils of her eyes so that you can see, and the reaction of what she is seeing rather than showing you what is happening in itself. So to me, it was a really, in the end, I really appreciated these difficulties, because they kind of open up new doorways and ways for you to tackle different issues. Another much easier in some way, but it has its own difficulties, is when you get given a story and you're told to create one image that tries to encapsulate a certain issue or a people's struggle or the whole issue just like in one image. So it's that whole issue of looking for images. It's like you have to feed yourself with so many images when it is not your own story. You have to try and feast basically on so many images to try and see what were there in the cells that they are in, what are they like, the actual bars. They're not going to be, fresh, kind of new bars like, say, in the UK or something. There were stories here, I think, of this transgender violence, was it, in South America?
Yeah.
And again, a huge issue that the comics deals with fantastically is anonymizing people. I'm so glad that Ben touched on that, because a lot of people have to stay anonymous, but they still have the right to have their stories heard and communicated. And drawing is a way to do that, where you can communicate the place, the situation, the atmosphere, the person, the issue, the heart of it, without putting them in danger. So this is something that I absolutely appreciated. And of course, any stories that are that take place in the Arab world, I am very much unapologetically Arab, and I am very proud of that. And it's just, I'm so thankful every single time I get given a story to work on that does hark back to my own roots, that like, I know this. When I drew the story of this Iraqi family, I mean, Iraqis for Arabs as old as me, For them, they are the sound of our childhood. You know, they are the dubbers of our cartoons that I told you about earlier. So it's like there's an affiliation there that, you know, that I feel to them. It's not like I'm Libyan and that's it. There's a special connection with being Arab as well. Again, when it comes to devising ways to tell a story, there was a series where this father was caught by ISIS and tortured for a week. And how do you show that without showing torture? So the only way to do that in the end was to show how he changes, how he slowly gets broken down as a person, as a character through his facial features. And you can imagine, it's amazing how poignant and how powerful imagination is. Because a lot of the time, if you just drew lines on a person's face, if you every single line gives you a story in your head that you can imagine, and no way can a person ever draw something more powerful than you can imagine. That's why a lot of the times I would say that some of the most powerful horror movies are those that allow your imagination to do most of the work rather than spelling it out for you. And likewise, playing around with these narrative sequences, I found that to be the case. Was there anything that working together or working with artists or these stories that you kind of ran into that was different to?
So this particular one was just interesting for me, that we tried to use the same methodologies that I'd used in Sri Lanka of going backwards and forwards with the script, with the artwork, but the protagonist was in Mosul in northern Iraq, where we didn't have access to. So this was going through UN Women, wasn't it? Who had field officers on the ground. And so first we had to kind of train that field officer up over a Skype of why we were doing this project and how we would do it, and then use all of those methodologies that I was talking about from the Sri Lanka experience to do that kind of remotely through a third person. So that it was really important that what we don't produce is fiction, that this is as close to someone's lived experience, but it was a very new model for us to work with someone that was completely remote in a place that we'd never met. And now we work on using that kind of methodology a lot in places like Afghanistan, in northern Nigeria, where we just don't have access to those places, but there's local staff for NGOs or the UN on the ground that we can work through. Yeah.
It's very interesting also to note that PositiveNegatives is taking it a step further right now, in that before what I used to get was the script. So like the researchers on the ground have spoken to people, and this is the script that you now need to draw. People who are not artists themselves or do not tell stories, you know, for a living, they're not going to approach usually stories from a storyteller's point of view. So they will give you facts. So one thing that PositiveNegatives is now doing that I think is fantastic is that they are involving artists in that process of research. So I get to speak to the actual people in question myself. I get to talk to them directly, because there are all sorts of the slight little details that either make or break a story. Because in the end, for a person who is reading this, who you are trying to represent, you need to have things in there that go, I understand that only a person in my situation would know or would have noticed something like this. And you can only get that from speaking directly to people. So like something that before I would get lots of issues about, like, these are difficulties that the characters faced. But then there would be something about a really funny story or something that happens. And I think, this is going to humanize it. Because if you give people a spiel of just, this is misery, and then more misery, and more misery. This is something that a lot of people cannot really connect with, because they've never gone through something the same. If you give them things that they can relate to, that these people, even if they're going through all of this, in the end they are exactly like you or I. Their struggles are the same, their dreams are the same, their hopes for the future mirror your own. Their hopes for their children, their families, it's something so very human, so very shared amongst all of us. So it's bringing that forward, I think, that is brilliant. And at the moment, the latest project that I'm working on with PositiveNegatives is a long story of about 26 chapters that I got to write and draw by myself after speaking to young people, and again I bring back to them, and to see their absolute elation when they say, "This is so cool, is this really going to," it's just, again, that I'm doing this for another people, for another section of society, for children who do not have that representation, for them to feel, this is so goddamn cool, you know. So I hope to keep doing that Positive Negatives. It's just an amazing experience, and it's so difficult to put into words what an honor it is to be able to do something that you love, but at the same time feel is also having a positive impact on the world in some form or another. Thank you very much.
Right, Q&A. We're happy to take any questions if anyone has any. There's a mic. And there's a mic.
Hi. Both of you've referenced mouse.
Sorry? Sorry.
I don't know how to.
Sorry.
Both of you've referenced mouse. Here, okay.
Yeah.
And in that, Art Spiegelman uses the process of interviewing to frame the narrative and to create a dynamic between the interview process and the explaining the story. From what I've seen of Positive Negatives, you don't reference the interview process. You keep it slightly distant. Is that what was the thinking behind that?
Really, that I found it was more powerful if we told the stories from the first person. So Mouse is slightly different, that it's Art Spiegelman interviewing his father, and therefore he's very much part of the story, because his relationship with his father is a bit cantankerous, and some of the stories that pop up in the book obviously affect Art as the son. And so I think he's got a very clear space in that book, in that narrative. For me, I don't. I appear in, I think, 2 or 3 panels of the Sri Lankan book as a UN worker, but I mean, Lindsay drew it as me with big ears and glasses, and but the story's not about me, and so Joe Sacco does the same as well.
Yeah, I was about to mention Joe Sacco, actually. Yeah.
He draws himself as the journalist in Palestine, in Bosnia, interviewing people, and that's fine, that's his style. I prefer to give the first person voice to the respondents. It's just a style that was kind of chosen from the Sri Lanka one and then kind of just carried on, really.
To be fair, actually, I was going to mention Joe Sacco if you weren't, because that was something that, as an Arab, you know, like at the time reading, and again, very excited that a book is going to come out, or that it has images that I know. It really created a huge rift, that, I think, storytelling style, that it always reminded you that it's not about you. The main character here, in the end, is him. And you are just getting glimpses of second-hand things that he experiences from his Western journalistic point of view. So in the end, for me, even though I was really excited, and I still really appreciate all of his work into all of the different places that he has gone into, but I do not think it is a substitute at all for work that is done from the point of view of the people themselves. I think as a person, if you have any connection at all to the story, you're constantly reminded this is not your story. It's about you, kind of, but not really. Yeah, so I'd say that would be probably the main issue with that, unless you are part of the story like Art Spiegelman was in Mouse. Yeah.
I was just going to ask if the what you've done to date is done in local languages, and then second of all, if the work that you've done to date has been done and produced in local languages. And my second question is, have you considered taking the comics one step further and to make animated film?
So yeah, we've now translated, I think we've worked in 18 languages. Not all of them have been translated. It's a bit of so we're with our Sri Lanka one at the moment. It's been produced and written in English, And now we're talking to Tamil publishers, and we've got an issue that the Tamil script is massive, and the speech bubbles are designed for an English script, and suddenly a sentence that is this big in English is this big in Tamil. So there might be a slight design issue, but we've produced stuff that your Nadia one went into Arabic.
Yes, it did.
So
and Japanese as well for some reason.
And so we flipped the pages, so you obviously read it right to left, and on Photoshop you can just put the new languages in, and that's something that's wonderful now that we're based at SOAS, Positive Negatives. So we've got the language school there that can help us translate all of these. We also have an educational branch to Positive Negatives where we take all of the comics that we produced out to schools, and we're working with local teachers to put lesson plans into the comics so that you read any one of these, and at the end of it, they're discussion points for migration, for conflict, for violence, for gender, for all those issues as an educational tool. And that's been picked up very, very quickly by school kids and teachers. For the animated form, yes, some of the ones that the last ones that we were showing here, this was actually a 5-minute animation. We just knew that we wouldn't have time to play it today, but they're all on our website. And we started to go into, I think 5 or 6 minutes has been the longest animation that we've done. But it's something that we're exploring quite a lot.
However, I do always like to put in a vote for comics over animation, because the greatest thing probably for me about comics is having the ability to tell something in a cinematic style, both visually written, with one person. So to have the power to create a whole almost cinematic narrative alone. You are the cameraman, you are the producer, you're the director, you're the artist, you are the person who sources like the props. You are everything, and you're able to do that with a pencil and a piece of paper. There is something so very egalitarian to me about this, because people, no matter how, when I started drawing, for me, it was done almost in secret away from, my father, and it was a teacher who kept giving me pencils and paper in school, and she kept these pencils and paper for me in school and kept the drawings that I made so that my dad didn't realize that I was wasting my time in school. And it was just incredible to me that I can do all of this and I can practice this just using paper and pencil. The other thing I just want to mention very quickly, with animation versus drawn, is that at the beginning I didn't know, of course, that this was that there were actual printed graphic novel forms of this. So before, you just used to be, I would be watching something on TV and I tried to draw as quickly as possible before the image changed on the TV. This is back when, guys, there was no internet where you can pause whatever. I mean, video, if you paused it, I think it paused for 30 seconds and then starts playing again, something like that. So I just had to learn fast. And then when I found the actual books, there's something about it where you give it out and you hand it out, especially to places that are disadvantaged, that it's a double pronger of, first of all, being able to enjoy these stories and being able to live through them, and that's such an entertainment. And secondly, it provides a still way for people to learn how to draw without the picture moving. Before, I likened it to almost like if you're watching an animation and you're trying to learn how to draw. It's like somebody going okay, you're trying to learn aviation mechanics. Stand here, in a few seconds there's going to be an airplane that's going to fly on top of you. Try to study it as quickly as possible before it goes and it's gone. Now you have to wait for the next one. Versus having a plane that is just stood there for you to examine from all directions at your own leisure for as long as you want or need. And when I found graphic novels, holy, I did not know that was a thing. It was all of the Christmases ever into one. And I'd say for Arab countries, this is something that I'm looking into in the future, because we have this animation, but we do not have a culture of printing and publishing. And I really hope in the future to do a lot of this, to translate into Arabic a lot of these very old classics and very much loved classics, and distribute them so that kids can actually learn how it's done, instead of just watch it almost helplessly and, well, there's nothing we can do, So anyway, vote for comics.
Hi. You were talking about how in Palestine it's from an outsider's point of view. And in a similar thing with Guy Delisle's comics about Burma and Pyongyang, where he goes into those places because he has worked there, rather not from a journalistic point of view, but for a source of income, it sort of gives him a form of epistemic privilege for him to look at how things work. And sometimes you get to share both sides of the story as well. So do you think sometimes it might be helpful if you have someone's point of view who isn't from the culture where the events are happening?
I'd say there's positives and negatives to every approach. So for some people probably who just want an introduction into a story or into a region or into an issue that is very mixed or complex issue, I'd say Palestine is definitely one of them. So for the casual reader or for a person who is not from the area, I think it is extremely beneficial as an introduction, to the area, to have somebody who is impartial to tell those stories. However, I do not believe it should be a replacement for people's actual real lived stories from both sides to tell you, in order for you to have a deeper understanding, a human understanding rather than a political one or a fleeting one. Because in the end, no matter what, if you go visit an area, even if you stay there 3 years, 5 years, no matter what, you are still a visitor. You are not part and parcel of the culture. You are still only being shown what they deem to be not shameful enough, for example, to show to an outsider. Oh, this is an outsider, you have to show a certain thing. So there is just so much to be explored when people actually express themselves by themselves or have that voice. But yeah, there's much to be said about every approach, and I think the more that we share stories that are not usually tackled, the better.
I think there's probably loads more questions, but I think you guys are sticking around for a drink now, so I'm sure those of you who want to get a drink from the bar, please feel free to do that. And for those of you who want to ask Ben and Asia more questions, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to answer them. So please give a warm round of applause to Ben Dix and Asia Alfasi. Thank you.
Thank you.